Smith from the community of human and organizational learning, and I'm just slowly introducing the webinar for today. I'm just killing a little bit of time to make sure we have everybody in from the waiting room, and it looks like we have almost everybody. So welcome to today's webinar. We have Tony Machera with us, who's going to talk about systems learning for human or systems learning for human and organizational performance. And Tony is going to take questions and comments throughout. So after we do a little bit of intro for Tony, what I'd invite you to do is sit back, listen, and just give a lot of thought to what he's offering to us in terms of expertise and insights. Feel free to chat in the chat box, or even better, raise your hand when you have a question or a comment, and I'll bring you into the conversation. And that way we can make it like a great dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
So with that, Tony Machera, thank you very, very much for joining us. And a sincere thanks for sharing your time and wisdom with us. And I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Dean. I appreciate the opportunity. And this is one of my favorite topics. And so I don't get tired about sharing about human and organizational performance. But my purpose today is to introduce this concept of systems learning. And a key element of systems learning is the idea of systems thinking. But you mentioned the word expert. I'm not an expert. People who are experts have the initials PhD after their name. But I do consider myself a specialist. I specialize in this area. So I've spent a lot of time studying human and organizational performance over the years. But my purpose today is to we have less than an hour to talk about this, and I'm not going to obviously not going to be able to cover all aspects of systems thinking and systems learning. But what I want to do is just essentially put a stone in your shoe. You know how that feels like, right? You can't ignore a stone in your shoe. So I just want to put that prompt in front of you to think more deeply about how this applies to human and organizational performance in an industrial environment. Let me go ahead and just get started here. You'll see the young lady here and the thought illustration here, and you got two gears intermeshed, and it illustrates the relationship that I'm trying to create here. Is we want to look at the system and how it interacts to create the conditions for performance. And so fundamentally, I just want to help the audience think and learn what does it mean to use systems thinking and to better understand fundamentally the difference between work as done and work as imagined, and that relationship between those two. Why are they different, and how can we influence that gap between the two? So I think it's worthwhile for us as human and organizational performance professionals to understand this relationship. So let's move on through there. Some of you may already know Bill Corcoran. Sadly, he passed away back in 2018, but he was one of the early presenters and supporters of the HPRCT conference that was the predecessor of CHOL. And he was always known, and I got his Firebird Forum newsletter on a routine basis. And he was known for saying this quote: "Things are the way they are because managers want them that way, or managers tolerate them that way, or managers are unaware of them." And that was a common refrain in his newsletter. But I want to add a fourth item to this. And fundamentally, it might be already stated in some ways in what he's already said. But I believe that managers do not fully understand how their organizations work. And that's what systems thinking brings to the table, is to help managers understand human performance in a complex environment. And when you add human beings to a system, you immediately create a complex environment. So let's move on here. I love this cartoon by the Larson, and it's two Vikings on the prow of a Viking longboat. And the one starts speaking. He says, "I've got it too, Omar. A strange feeling that like we've just been going around in circles." And it illustrates that managers sometimes in their offices, they design work, they design their work systems to accomplish some certain purpose, but it just doesn't seem to be going in the direction they want it to go, but they don't fully understand. They haven't gotten out of their office and gotten into the workplace to see what's actually happening. And managers and their staff tend to overly simplify human performance. And this illustration comes from Sidney Decker's field guide to understanding human error. And I got permission to use this illustration because I think it's apropos to systems thinking. But as human beings, we have a tendency to simplify and take human performance out of context of the system and then analyze that performance in isolation, as you can see to the right there. Um, and because the operator is the primary adaptive component or the primary agent of the system, there's a tendency to assign blame to the operator or whenever something doesn't go right. It's whoever touched the system last. And so we tend to think that people are always rational, always or all seeing, all knowing, all the time. And that's simply not true. If we can resist the temptation to blame, who do we blame or what do we blame? um, the system. That's the answer. We ought to be looking at the system. So if you adopt the principles that people have value and dignity as human beings, and that most people want to do a good job, you should naturally focus on the system. So if you adopt those two principles, well, what do we pay attention to? I think you should naturally fall to looking at the system. I tell a lot of people that explaining, now, this is a convoluted statement, so follow me closely. Explaining failure with failure fails to explain failure. Let that sink in a bit. Explaining failure with failure, human error, fails to explain why things went wrong. And so things don't have to go wrong to suffer harm. Everything can work as designed, work as imagined, or as expected. You can still suffer harm because of misalignments and things that were not foreseen ahead of time. And the pictures you see here in this slide is a suggestion of where we're going to be going with systems thinking. Pictures is fundamentally the way we're going to create understanding in systems thinking. And I want to, before we continue and define the idea of systems and systems thinking, I want to compare linear thinking with systems thinking. And uh, linear thinking is illustrated in the traditional thinking. A causes B, and then B causes C, and then C causes D. That's the traditional cause and effect. And what tends to drive this is because of the human constraint called bounded rationality. The human mind can only hold so much information at one time, and so we have a tendency to overly simplify cause and effect. You could say that linear thinking or the traditional approach to cause and effect is fast thinking, whereas systems thinking is going to be what I refer to as uh, uh, slow thinking. Systems thinking looks at the interaction of not only cause and effect, A causes B, but sometimes B can have an influence on A. All right. And systems thinking considers the environment in which performance is happening. And we commonly refer to a VUCA environment. There's volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity in the workplace. and there's hidden interactions between parts of the system. There's feedback that's occurring that we don't see. There's delays in feedback. And so systems thinking looks at performance from multiple perspectives. And again, this can sometimes slow down the analysis, and that's why I refer to systems thinking as slow thinking. So what do we mean by a system? System, real simply, is an arrangement of parts to accomplish some kind of purpose. And the reason for the system is always outside of the system. It's usually to serve some purpose for a higher system. But a system always has inputs: energy, matter, solids, liquids, or gases, or information. And that's what the E, M, and I represent there under inputs. And then the outputs, the system generates some kind of output. And these are always emergent properties. These are the outcomes of the way the system works internally. And when you talk about a particular system, you have to say, okay, what's the boundary? And that's always been not an innocuous concept to me, but Dr. Russ Akoff, really helped me understand this by identifying what are the essential parts necessary for the system to perform its purpose. And so fundamentally, uh, uh, this is what I would say is a system concept that we should be looking at when we analyze performance. So here's an example. Now, this is a 1953 DeSoto sedan. This was my first car when I turned uh, back somewhere in the 1960s. All right, this was my grandmother's car. And what's unique about it, it was the first vehicle that had an automatic transmission, but this had a transmission that had a clutch. So you had a clutch in order to change the transmission from park to drive. Once you got it in drive, then you can step on the accelerator and drive away. But the question is, what's an automobile system? And here are the essential parts. You got an engine, you have a chassis, you have wheels, you need brakes and steering. And without the operator, it still just sits there. And so the idea is to transport the operator or the or the people in the car from one point to another. That's the purpose. And what's interesting is they all interact. These parts are interacting. And if you take one of the parts away, that vehicle cannot perform its function. Even the operator, you take that operator away, the vehicle cannot perform its function of transporting one place to another place. And and it's interesting that the parts cannot do what the system does. The wheels by themselves cannot transport people from one place to another place. The engine by itself cannot transport people from one place to another place. So the challenge is to understand the performance. To understand performance, we have to look at the whole. You have to look at the whole look at performance in context. And so that's going to be one of the key learnings going forward, is to understand that we have to resist the temptation to take the operator out of the system to understand performance. We need to understand performance within context. Now, the system has a purpose. It has a set of parts, and they're connected. They're interacting with each other, and that's what we consider the structure. And you'll notice in the illustration here that there's a lot of lines, interactions. The green typically represents a physical interaction between parts, whereas the yellow tends to represent information between the operator and parts of the vehicle. And so that's fundamentally what we mean by a system. Now, Eric Holnagel had some comments about systems, and managers have a tendency to be overly optimistic about the efficacy of their systems. But I usually ask managers in a instructor-led class, true or false? What's true or false here? Facility systems are flawlessly designed and scrupulously maintained. What that says in effect is that the plan is effectively safe. Designers foresee and anticipate all contingencies, and that suggests that work is routine and there are no surprises. Procedures are complete, correct, available, and usable for every occasion. And the implication here is that compliance creates safety. And then, sorry, and then people behave as they are expected to. They always do what they're trained to do according to expectation. And then finally, the system is basically safe and it must be protected from unreliable human beings. The suggestion here that people are the hazard. And we know by just looking at all those are all false. Those are false statements. And managers need to recognize that they are managing a complex adaptive system because of people. And system operations are rarely trouble-free. Planners do not anticipate all contingencies. Budgets are approximations. Equipment wears out due to entropy. Plans are always incomplete. Schedules are rough guesses based on experience. Procedures have inaccuracies in them. Systems and components may not be properly configured. Equipment wears out. So there's a number of things that are not quite right whenever people go out and do work. And so the Jenga tower there suggests this. Those gaps in the Jenga tower represent hidden weaknesses to a manager whose perspective is from the top. And we don't really know where the transfer of where the gravity actually is transferred through the tower. So there's something that's always going to be overlooked. So the system itself is inherently conflicted based on the multiple goals it's trying to accomplish. And I like to illustrate this a little bit later with the Jens Rasmussen model that we're going to talk about. But before we do that, I want to clearly define what I mean by systems learning. First, what is a system? A set of parts assembled and fitted together, which I'm going to refer to as structure, to accomplish a desired purpose or function. And whenever I use the word function, it's usually equipment related, technology related, and purpose is usually has a social context or element to it. So that's what we mean by system. What do we mean by learning? And you'll notice the photo there of Donella Meadows, and I'm a big fan of her work. She wrote a book called Thinking in Systems, and I have that footnoted there so you can refer to that later. But she says that learning is the acquisition of information that prompts a change in behavior of the system by realigning its structure towards a desired purpose. Notice the linkage there with the definition of system. And she says what we're trying to do is make success more likely, failure less likely, and adaptive capacity more refined. So if we put these two concepts together, fundamentally, I believe systems learning is the effective application of new knowledge through discovery into a system structure. And we have to understand what that structure looks like before we can actually learn, so that we can enhance the capacity to accomplish the system's purpose and avoid unwanted outcomes. In other words, success. And I'm a big proponent of the phrase "live long and prosper." And yes, I'm a Star Trekkie. A lot of folks think that the phrase "live long and prosper" comes from Spock in that television series, but it actually has a different origin, which I'll share later. So that's what we mean by systems learning. And I just kind of boil this down by saying that, we talk about lessons learned, but a lesson learned is not learned until there's a change in behavior. A lesson learned is not learned until there's a change in behavior. And we're going to talk about behavior collectively as well as individually. So here's the Now, this is a little bit of theory. I think it's important that we understand this this model. This is from Jens Rasmussen. The work of Jens Rasmussen probably represents the most influential. He's probably the most influential contributor to the field of safety science and human error and accident research over the last half century, and it's still apropos today. But as you look at this illustration, this is not an XY plot. If you're a student of history, this is probably more better. It's better understood by looking down on a battlefield. You're looking down on a battlefield and looking at the forces that are arranged against each other by looking down on the battlefield. And then noticing that we have economic pressures. There's an economic failure boundary, and then there's pressures from a workload perspective, from the light gray line there in the bottom right. And then there's always physical assets in the organization, and that's represented by the solid red line, and that represents asset failure. The dotted line before the asset failure line is your administrative limits represented typically in your procedures. And procedures are used to define the operating point. Where can we operate and still be economically profitable, as far as the economic failure, but also where do we want to operate in terms of the workload as far as the frontline workers are concerned. But those two forces tend to put pressure on the operating point, and it tends to drift towards the safety limits to the left. All right, and I'm going to play a little bit of an animation. And Dean, let me know if this is working. The operating point, there's a blue operating point there, and this is the space of possibilities, and it moves during work. And you notice that I got two operating points. One is in black, work as imagined, and the other one is work as done. And notice they're not the same. This is alluding to the black line, blue line perspective that many of us are familiar with, work as done versus work as imagined. And that difference is created by the VUCA environment in which work is done. So there's an influence that's causing a deviation or a gap, if you will, between the operating point and in reality and the one that's desired through work as imagined. And another reason, I'm just checking my notes here, I believe that one of the reasons that this gap persists is due to goal conflicts. There's real-time conflicts, and you've heard the phrase faster, better, cheaper, and also safer. And you can't do all four of those at the exact same time. So the frontline workers are having to adapt and adjust and trying to achieve all those concurrent goals simultaneously. And it's near impossible to accomplish all of them at the same time. So we're going to come back to this, and it's important that we understand this concept that that the economics and the workload tend to put pressure and move the operating points towards the left, towards the safety of our assets in the operating system. So here's a perspective. Here's a way of thinking about that operating point, and this is illustrated by an illustration that's derived from David Wood's book, Behind Human Error. And the blunt end is the organizational structure, and the sharp end is defined by the work that's done in the operating environment. And there's a pressure, there's flow of information that actually creates this operating point that I referred to just a few minutes ago with the Jens Rasmussen illustration. And here on the left, I'm showing the relationship to work as imagined. That's the design of work that creates local conditions in reality, and the workers have to adjust, and that's the work as done. And I like this quote from Edwards Deming. He says, performance is governed by the system and management is responsible for the system. And this goes back, this alludes to the fact that we have a tendency to blame the worker when things don't go right. And we have to realize that people don't necessarily come to work to do a bad job. And, uh, and, uh, and we have to believe that people are wanting to do the right thing. And so we have to start looking at the system rather than just simply take the worker out of the system and analyze their performance out of context. Now, here's a different way of looking at this system perspective, and it's a little more nuanced. It provides a little more information, and it shows the interface between a behavior, the operation, and the assets, the work output, because this shows the business relationship. Those assets, or rather the work outputs, are ultimately delivered to customers in the business environment. And I'm a believer, frontline workers need to understand how their work influencers are actually interfaces with the business of the organization. So they need to understand that just as well. They need to understand safety. Okay, and the down arrows also represent connections. There's multiple, and this is just for illustration purposes, but there's more than 6 interfaces between organization and local factors. Fundamentally, managers don't manage behavior and safety and culture directly. They're at the sharp end. What they actually influence, what they actually manipulate are the local factors, the conditions people work in. So fundamentally, the structure of the system are the top 2, organizational factors and the local factors. That's what I'm going to refer to as structure. All right, let's put this all together with the Jens Rasmussen model. So I look at the Jens Rasmussen model and it reminds me of a whale. It looks like a whale. And so I call it the whale illustration for simplicity. And the black dot there represents the operating point of the work being done in the field. So what actually influences the economic boundary? What actually influences the workload? What influences the actual state of or the safety limits of the assets involved? Well, this illustrates the local factors. Going back to my system perspective, the blunt end and sharp end illustration. So those local factors are actually influencing the operating point in the here and now. And then what influences the local factors? All right, here you go. This is another way of looking at what managers are actually influencing is not so much the performance in the workplace as much as they are influencing local factors. Now, where do those come from? What do managers use to design their organization? And this is where this idea of mental models comes into play. Mental models are the beliefs and the assumptions, the values and priorities that managers use. This is what they think is necessary in order to create and achieve their business goals. And that's how they design their system. And that's going to ultimately influence where they operate. So the question is, and again, we're trying to understand why is there, how do we use systems thinking to learn why there's a gap between work as done and work as imagined. So why do systems work so well most of the time? And we pretty much already know that Sidney Dekker introduced the idea of local rationality. People do things that make sense at the time, otherwise they wouldn't do it. But again, they're juggling multiple goals. Again, faster, better, cheaper, safer. And so it's a challenge for them to take this this system that's inherently conflicted and not totally safe at all times. There's always something not quite right with the system, so they have to adjust on a routine basis. But what systems thinking does is it helps explain the difference between work as done and work as imagined. So what do we mean by systems thinking? And this comes right out of Peter Senge's book, The Fifth Discipline. And I would encourage you to take that book off the shelf, dust off the dust, and spend some time reviewing it. It's still very appropriate. And there's a second edition to that book, by the way. I think it was in 2009. A second edition was published. But this is his definition of systems thinking. It's a management discipline of understanding, and that's a key word, understanding system performance. And the B plus R is my definition of human performance, behavior plus results. But it's the understanding of system performance as the outcome, the emergent outcome of the interactions between the parts of the system. And systems thinking helps you see the whole. All right. Now, what's the tool? All right, this is a tool that should help you as a system thinker. How do we go about thinking in systems thinking? And it's usually referred to as an iceberg model, but I'm showing you as showing the tool as a pyramid per se. But the reason the iceberg model analogy is used because there's some parts of the system that are invisible, obscure to observation, and that's what I'm trying to illustrate here with the iceberg model to the right. But generally, we start with an event or some occurrence or maybe it's an opportunity that we need to take advantage of. And so the question is, okay, what have been the patterns of behavior? What has the operating point been doing over the last period of time, whatever that period of time is appropriate for our analysis. And that defines work as done. So the pattern of behavior, sometimes this is referred to as behavior over time or bot charts. And so what are we looking at over a period of time? So we're actually defining work as done. So the next question is what's the structure? What's the structure? What are the interactions that's driving behavior? And one of the common refrains in systems thinking is structure drives behavior. And you'll notice there the initials LF and OF. That's short form for local factors and organizational factors. So the local factors and organizational factors of our systems perspective model that I showed earlier serve as the structure that's influencing these behaviors in the workplace. And ultimately, managers, remember I showed the relationship of, well, the Jens Rasmussen model with performance or systems perspective, blunt end, sharp end model. And it shows the influence that mental models have on the structure, the building of the structure. So fundamentally, learning is going to be all about realigning that structure to get the behavior you want consistent with purpose. All right. And transformational change usually resides at the mental model level. If we can change the way managers are thinking and executives are thinking about performance, fundamentally you'll get the structure that's more consistent with more consistently achieving success and avoiding harm in achieving their mission. So that's the pattern. Events, patterns, structure, and mental models is what system thinking is all about. All right. Now, I mentioned earlier that I was going to talk about pictures, and this is helpful in understanding systems thinking. And this is probably the most effective tool that I've come across. In fact, Dana Meadows in her book, Thinking in Systems, uses stock flow diagrams almost exclusively. She doesn't even refer to, in her index, she doesn't even refer to causal loop diagram. And that's something you might come across when you dig into systems thinking. But this is basically a bathtub illustration. And what do I mean by a bathtub illustration? The square box there, the rabbit or using the rabbit population in a field is the tub itself. You know, you fill it up with water, and what determines the level of water in a bathtub? Well, it's the amount of water coming in and the amount of water being drained out. And so there's a flow rate of rabbits into the population, the rabbit population, and there's a flow rate of deaths. There's a flow rate of rabbit decreasing the rabbit population. So you got births and deaths, and the idea of birth fraction there is just it's a constant that represents how many female rabbits have the capability of actually birthing other rabbits. And you can notice that as the population goes up in the square bucks, that's the stock, that has an influence on the number of births. So more females, more births. So that influences the level of rabbits in this particular area. But also, it also influences the number of deaths. The more rabbits, the more deaths. And as the population increases, the density of rabbits increase. That may reduce the average lifetime of rabbits. So you can see the thinking here that goes on. And so you could take your KPIs of your organization, the key performance indicators that might be represented as a stock, and then what causes it to go up, what causes it to go down. And fundamentally, that's what causal loop diagramming is all about, is what influences the population, and then how does the population influence other things? And so you're basically asking the question, what does this concept influence, and then how is this concept or this idea influenced by other elements of or other parts of the system? So drawing pictures helps explain, or helps from a human perspective. I know it helps me is when I better understand things if I can draw a picture of what's going on. Again, I go back. Let me go back to the previous slide here. Again, I'm not illustrating enough information here to make you an expert in causal loop diagram or in stock flow diagrams. But again, I'm just suggesting this might be where you can start spending some time using this technique to better understand how your system is working. So there's the system perspective, the blunt end, sharp end illustration, organizational factors, create the local factors which influence work. All right. And what I'm going to illustrate you here is systems learning. This is what I mean by systems learning. And when things don't go quite right in the workplace, now we can apply systems thinking, which is looking at applying the iceberg model. And so here at the top, we have work as imagined. That's the original design that managers put in place to accomplish work. But perhaps the work as done is not quite what we want. All right. So we apply systems thinking to better understand what's really happening in reality. And we use that to provide feedback to make adjustments or realign our structure to better achieve our system purpose. So this is an overarching perspective on systems learning. Now I know I'm throwing out a lot of information here, and hopefully you'll take these slides and study them a little bit later after the webinar. But now let's look at learning itself. When we talk about learning, it's, the idea here is we want to make some adjustments to the structure. Notice over to the right, you'll see the word structure, and it's alluding to organizational factors and local factors. All right, so we want to make some realignment of those in order to get the business results that we want. Now notice alignment. We want to align the organization to get the business results. And we have to work through local factors to influence people's behavior choices and actions when they do work. And when people do work, they accomplish work outputs. These are the things that are left over when the work is done. All right, this is the value that was created after the work was done. And that value is delivered to the customer, and that's the business result. Now notice the subscripts R1, W1, B1, L1, O1. Okay, that's the initial. What if that's not what you want? We want a new business result, so that's an R2. Well, you can't just go back directly to organizational factors. You have to work yourself uh, uh, back through from bottom to top in order to realign the system. So you have to work backwards. And so what new work outputs do we need to achieve the new business result? And that may require, likely will require, a new set of choices, a new set of behaviors and actions. That would be the new B2. Well, what are the new local factors that are necessary to accomplish those behaviors? Again, structure drives behavior. So we have to know what the new behavior is before we can design the new structure, local factors, and organizational factors. So it goes that way. It doesn't just simply go from 5 back up to 1. We have to work our way back through the system. And I emphasize that organizations are perfectly tuned to get the results that they are getting. Now, I mean, this principle has been around for probably over a century now, and it's still true today. That fundamentally what we're doing with systems learning is retuning the system to get. You could say we want to be less wrong. It's one way of saying we want to be less wrong. We're constantly monitoring our system. We're constantly readjusting the system. In fact, this is what Alcoa Aluminum did. Uh, 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 um, I think it was Paul O'Neill, the chief executive officer, who put the focus on safety, and he basically said we're going to focus on learning and creating a more a nuanced approach to how we do business. We know we're not going to give you a perfect system, but we're going to learn and readjust the system to be less wrong, so to speak.
Hey, Tony, I'm
Yeah,
just going to
yeah.
interrupt real quick. I wasn't totally clear. If you could go back one slide, please. There's a a rectangle labeled BOT.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Good catch there. That refers to the patterns, the behavior over time. All right.
Okay, thank you. Thank you
Yeah,
very
good
much.
catch. Good catch. So, yeah, again, using in fact, let me go back to this illustration here, the patterns of behavior. The patterns of behavior, you're looking at behavior over time, and that time frame could vary based on, we could be looking at hours, minutes, or it could be days, weeks, it could be years. So whatever the performance we're analyzing will determine what kind of time frame we're looking at for a pattern, trying to
Got it.
detect a pattern.
Thank you.
Yeah, good point. Are there any other questions in the chat box?
Not right now.
Not right now. I'm basically got a fire hose going here, so I apologize. I'm trying to cover a lot here in the few minutes we have. All right. All right. So we're near the end of my presentation, but here's the learning process, systems learning process, and it's 3 parts: discovery, understanding, and learning. And first, discovery is basically how do we recognize departures from desired performance? What are the opportunities relative to purpose or function of the system? And so you know, I'm not going to go into detail, but first we have to recognize departures from desired performance. There has to be a dissatisfaction with current performance before we make any attempts to understand why it's happening. And then understanding. So the second part of systems learning, we have to understand the system. We have to look at the whole. And again, we're using the iceberg model here. This is the application of systems thinking. Understanding is accomplished by looking at the system. Uh, the event, what happened, what's the consequence relative to our purpose. What are the patterns? What's been happening over time? That's work as done. What's the structure? What are the forces that are creating this pattern? And that's our work as imagined. That again, the forces are the outcomes of your organizational factors and your local factors. And then if you want transformational change, what you ultimately want to do is change the mental models that created those structures. What's the thinking that created or sustains the structure that's currently in place? That's the second part of systems learning. And the third part is actually realigning. And that goes back to my previous slide. You have to work back from business results through the structure, through the systems inverted pyramid model to get to a new structure that will get more closely aligned to accomplishing your system purpose. Discovery, understanding, and learning. By the way, I'm getting distracted. I'm looking out the side of my window in my office, and a herd of deer just went past my window. So I've been checking out all the bucks and the doe. So it's amazing.
Did they
Anyway,
stop to eat your landscaping on the way?
no, this is just a pass. This is a highway between the two houses along all the deer that comes through here. Even in North Atlanta, there's a lot of deer.
Yeah.
Um, I like this quote by Dr. James Reason. He says it's easier to manage the conditions humans work in than to change the human condition. And what's he referring to? He's referring to local factors. He says it's easier to manage the local factors than it is to change the human condition. And that's absolutely true. And that's what managers are managing. Managers are managing local factors by adjusting and realigning their structure to drive behavior. And there's another statement here by Russ Akoff. He said the only thing harder than starting something new is to stop something old. And you notice all the paper airplanes that are lined up there on the left. That's the old behavior, and it's hard to stop that. And but the idea is this is also accomplished by looking at the structure. The structure will drive behavior, and that managers need to be students of the structure. And how can they better understand the structure? Systems thinking. So what are the takeaways here? I believe one, systems learning has three parts. Discovery. You can't change anything. You can't learn until you know that there's an issue, whether it's a problem or an opportunity, and then you got to spend some time understanding why is there a difference between what we're doing and what we design the system to do, and then realign it. That's the idea of learning. We want to change behavior not only of frontline workers, but also change the collective behavior of the organization. So that's a key takeaway. And then systems thinking itself. Fundamentally, systems thinking is helping you understand the flows of information and influence between and within the system, the organizational factors and the local factors and the workplace. How does the structure drive behavior in the workplace? And I have several sub bullets to that. So systems thinking enhances understanding of performance as an emergent outcome of the interactions, due to influence and feedback between parts of the system. Again, the focus, we have to understand performance as a whole, looking at the system as a whole. So it's a system. Now, this is important. Managers need need to adopt a systems perspective when things aren't quite going the way we anticipate. The first impulse of managers is to have a mindset of looking at the system. Well, what in the system is misaligned that perhaps is causing this emergent outcome? And then use the iceberg model. The iceberg model: event, patterns, structure, mental model. I think that's a key takeaway. And then systems thinking explains the difference. It explains the difference between work as done and work as imagined. So again, I just want to reiterate the fact that structure, the system, the organization, and local factors drives behavior. And the last point here, learning is realigning. Lessons learned are not learned until there's a change in behavior. All right. And this is a poem. I guess you call this a poem by Reverend John Donne. I'm sure many of you have heard this, but I'd like to read this to you. You know, no man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a part of the continent, a part of the main. If a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less, as well as if a promontory were, as well as any manner of thy friends or of thine own were. Any man's death diminishes me, because I am involved in mankind, and therefore never send to know for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. And so no man, no person is an island entire of itself. We're all part of the system, and we need to, if we want to understand performance, we got to look at the system. Now, obviously, I've covered a lot over the last 50 minutes, 45 minutes. And so I'm going to ask you to spend some time studying on your own. You can look at these slides, look at the references on each of the slides, but there's some good YouTube videos that I would encourage you to check out immediately. There's one, the first one there is if Russ Akoff had given a TED Talk. And this is about 25 years old, 30 years old, and it's very, very informative. It's about 20 minutes long. It's excellent. I mentioned Dana Meadows' Thinking in System and Peter Singe's book, The Fifth Discipline. There's a couple here that I think you ought to look at is Systems Thinking for Business and Management. And then Nancy Levinson's two books, Engineering a Safer World, which was 2011. And then I think System Safety Engineering, which is a 23 version, is really a rewrite of the 2011 book. But you might want to look at that. Yeah, it's a pretty expensive book, but anyway, it's got a lot of good stuff in it. And then the second video there is what is VUCA? Very, very insightful video, and it's all about systems and systems thinking and how VUCA is created from a systems perspective. So that's my presentation. I know that's way too much for the time we had, but really my purpose was to put a stone in your shoe to encourage you to look at systems thinking. And I'd like to read something real quick from a document, the Australian Institute of Health and Safety. They wrote a chapter called Systems and Systems Thinking, the core body of knowledge for the generalist occupational health and safety professional. And this is what the Australian Institute for Health and Safety, this is what they say about systems thinking. Although systems thinking approach is now dominant in safety science research, there remains a research and practice gap whereby the state-of-art models and methods described in this document are yet to be fully embraced by practicing safety professionals. So they recognize there's still a gap. And basically it's because our education system doesn't focus on systems thinking. It still tends to reinforce the traditional cause and effect linear approach to analysis. But it goes on to say that occupational health and safety professionals should consider the recommendations for systems thinking as core to OHS practice. So I encourage you to spend some time studying systems thinking and systems learning. So with that, I got 5 minutes left for entertaining any questions or comments or feedback or even pushback. pushback. I'd appreciate that.
Well, let's see if we get any of that, any of the latter. But right now, there's a clarifying question on slide 20, Tony, about the acronym CAPA that's in the bottom line.
Yeah,
So,
Kappa, that's your corrective actions, preventive actions.
okay,
Corrective actions, I think, in terms of after the fact, preventive actions are more proactive before the fact.
got it. Thank you. And someone asked, in thinking about all your key takeaways and what you've reflected on and the insights you've shared and encouragement you've shared, which, if you had to pick one, what's the top priority?
Um, I'd say the top priority, let's see, let me look at that. Out of the takeaways,
Yeah.
let's see. I would put the fact that the systems thinking, the iceberg model, that probably has the most uh, uh, leverage in helping me personally understand what how to think in terms of systems. So when you see performance, why is that performance happening? Well, let's look at the patterns over time. What has been happening that's creating that outcome? And then now we can ask the questions, what's the structure that's creating that pattern? And now we ask the question, what are those local factors that are influencing those behaviors? Why this, maybe the training or the knowledge level is not where it ought to be. Well, what influences the knowledge level? We can ask now, pull the thread. I call it pulling the thread. We can start looking at the training program and look at where, how do we create this knowledge, or how do we create this skill in the workplace? And that's an organizational factor. And then going to the next level, if you want transformational change, I'd say, what's the mental models that managers possess that are creating this structure that's influencing this pattern and these outcomes?
Thank you. Now we've got, looks like we've got a few minutes left, so I'm going to just ask everybody to just chat into the chat box if you got a question, or raise your hand, and we'll bring you in to the conversation. But Tony, here's my question for you while we're waiting for that in the few minutes we have left. As you speak with organizations, as you do the work do you find that organizations, leaders, whoever it uh, is systems thinking hard for organizations and hard for people?
Yes, it is, because it's not natural. I go back to, the linear thinking is fast thinking, systems thinking is slow. And so we as human beings tend to want to, minimize the amount of mental effort it takes. And by reducing the amount of mental effort, we also reduce the time it takes to think through things. So systems thinking is not natural because we don't educate, where traditionally it's been associated with science. If someone started talking to me, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, talking about systems thinking, my mind immediately goes back. Well, that's the scientific method. That's not normal everyday operation thinking, and so we're not used to it, and it's a little bit more hard work, but it takes time to build proficiency in systems thinking. But the challenge is linear thinking doesn't adequately explain performance in a complex environment. It's inadequate to understand human performance in what I call complex adaptive systems. All right, what makes, our systems are complex, and by definition, when you add human beings to a system, it becomes adaptive. People are making choices on the fly. They're making adjustments, are adapting to imperfect systems, and so that's a risk. That's an inherent risk in our operation. So you got to adopt systems thinking to better and more accurately understand what's really happening.
Which makes a lot of sense, but but as you said, it is hard to do because
Mhm.
you have to be deliberate about it, and you
Yeah.
have to be thoughtful,
As
and
a matter of
sometimes
fact,
day-to-day pressures add up.
yeah, yeah. One of the tools, popular tools, is learning teams. All right, learning teams is a very popular tool. I like learning teams, but the challenge, the nuance or the caveat associated with learning teams is it's at a worker level, and the workers may or may not understand the system. And so they understand what's happening in the sharp end, but they may not understand the performance from a systems perspective. So managers need to take what the learning team is providing them and apply systems thinking to better understand why the frontline workers are experiencing what they're experiencing.
Well, so two things. So three things, maybe four. I'm not sure. A, thank you for that explanation. Second one is there's a lot of appreciative feedback in the chat box for you, Tony, for the presentation and you sharing today. So there's that, and I echo that. Thank you very much. And acknowledging that I'm blowing it as your duly appointed facilitator and running over time. We have one more question. And
Okay.
yeah, it's just an interesting one about, are there organizations that are doing this well? Are there some that are just kind of gold standard?
Yeah, be honest with you, off the top of my head, nothing comes to my awareness. But what I encourage you to do is do the Google search. You do the Google search. Now, one thing I have discovered is there's not a whole lot on the phrase systems learning. Everything tends to default to systems thinking. If you do a search on systems thinking, you'll get a lot of hits on that concept. And there's a lot of resources out there on systems thinking, but not a whole lot on systems learning from a practical standpoint. And what I've encountered is I did a search on root cause analysis. You know what the most common tools that come up on root cause analysis is 5 whys and the fishbone diagram.
Yep.
Which is fundamentally a linear thinking approach. And so yeah, those are popular, but they're not going to get you to the those are not going to be as effective at helping managers understand their systems and what's really happening in the background than systems thinking would.
Tony, thank you very, very much for everything today. And again, there was a lot of great appreciative feedback in the chat box. So looks like everybody really enjoyed it and had a few takeaways of their own. And thank you for the encouragement that you gave to everybody about doing a little more research on our own and a little more learning.
Given the time, I'm not going to make. All I can do is put a stone in your shoe.
Thank you for that. And I've never heard that, so that gave me a good new visual to use, or whatever, cliche. So Tony, thank you. And everybody, thanks for taking the time today. And we look forward to seeing you on the next webinar. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you all.